Hello and welcome back to another Warlords of Draenor video. This time we're going to be talking about statistics. So Blizzard recently put out a blog post which basically highlights all the various stats that we're going to be using in the expansion. And yes, some of this was talked about during BlizzCon, however there have been a number of rather significant changes actually. A few of the new secondary stats have been cut from the game and one has been added. So let's just make our way through the post and get analysing. So first of all, for our existing secondary stats, as we know, hit, expertise, dodge, and parry have been removed. Look, you guys all know why they've been removed. Basically, Blizzard just didn't think there was much gameplay associated with them, and they just didn't think they were too much fun, and I tend to agree. Okay, so the first new stat is multi-strike, and this will grant your spells, abilities, and your auto attacks additional chances to activate. Now, back in BlizzCon, they said that multi-strike chance would split between two rolls and effectively have a 200% cap. That's actually been changed so that actually, well, makes a little bit more sense. Now the way it works is that there are two rolls, and the full chance of activating is given to both rolls with a 100% cap. So, to translate that into a real-world example, let's just say you have 55% multi-strike, and then you cast a fireball that does 1000 damage. Well, you will then, after that, have two separate chances of 55% to automatically follow up with another smaller fireball that does 300 damage. This means that every time you cast a fireball, you basically have a chance to have one large fireball and then two small ones, and they will leave your hands in quick succession. So this is actually really interesting to me. I think that multi-strike is going to look rather cool. I'll talk more about my actual opinions later on in the video though. Okay, so next they talked about bonus armor. Basically, they didn't think the dodge and parry were very useful, or they knew they were useful, but they didn't think they were very interesting, and they didn't like how they made some boss encounters extremely spiky. So they are now doing bonus armor as the tanking stat. Now this is going to be very valuable to tanks and will be tuned so that it is stronger than any other tanking secondary stat. And it will show up on rings, necklaces, cloaks, and trinkets. So if you're a tank and you get one of those slots that has bonus armor, chances are you're going to be using it. Okay, so next we have Amplify. Now this is actually not going to be in the game, and it's a stat that they tried out during the Siege of Orgrimmar with some trinkets, and the intent was for it to multiply the effect of your other secondary stats. However, they found that as they went on, they just noticed some design problems with it. Basically, they realized that it would quickly become the absolute best stat for everyone, and on top of that, even if they did apply some very heavy diminishing returns to it, the stat wouldn't really have that much of an interesting effect on your gameplay. So for all those reasons, it's being removed. They are also retiring Readiness. Now this is an interesting one. Basically what Readiness did was that it would reduce your cooldowns, and they said that initially this looked like a really fun, solid concept, but after they continued development, they found a little bit of a snag. Basically, Readiness works in great quantities on the scale of maybe one or two trinkets like in the Siege of Orgrimmar, but as they expanded that to the point where you could potentially have Readiness in all of their gear, it just got really problematic. Basically, they, using a damage dealing class as an example, most of the stats value comes from letting you use one of your just temporary CDs, like I know, Arcane Power, Recklessness, something like that, more often. So most of these cooldowns will increase your damage while active, which is really quite substantial, but doesn't really compare well against other secondary stats. As in, it's a very different effect, it's harder to gauge the value of it from class to class. So if, for example, you stacked a lot of crit and then maybe got 30% crit from your gear, that's more or less just a 30% passive increase to your damage. That's easily scalable and it's easily understandable. Well, because of the way that all these different cooldowns interact with your already established stats, it just gets very confusing and hard to balance. So because of that, they are not going to put it in as a main secondary stat. However, it will possibly still be in the game in the form of trinkets, just like with the Siege of Orgrimmar. Then, with these two stats being removed, they've decided to add a new one. It's going to be called Versatility, and it's an interesting stat in that it's kind of understandable, but it's not a particularly exciting one. Basically, every 1% versatility you get will give you a 1% increase to damage, healing, absorbs, and it will also reduce the damage you take by 0.5%. It's very simple, and it is just a obvious upgrade to your primary role. So yeah. Now, it's not going to be as good as other things, though. They are going to tune it so that it's always useful, but it's never really going to be the best secondary stat. I think that makes sense, because if the most simple one is the best, then it's just not very interesting. They also said that it's going to help out with versatility. Basically, the sentence they said is, it'll be especially attractive to hybrids who want to feel more hybrid-y. I'd imagine that this is in terms of gearing, though, not really a hybrid spec. So if you were a paladin that had a lot of versatility, it would mean that your tank gear that had versatility would still be sort of useful to maybe your DPS spec, in that it would be more useful than, say, bonus armor. However, if you want to be a serious tank, you're going to need to stack your bonus armor. Though, if you had something that, say, had bonus armor and versatility, it at least would be a little bit more useful in DPS. So that's that. Now next, let's talk about some of the minor stats that they're adding to the game. So the first one is movement speed. This basically will give you a small increase in your movement speed. It won't be very large, but it's going to stack with other sources of movement speed. And they're going to try to keep the benefit of this rather low so that it's just going to feel like a fun bonus, not really a large increase in character power. I have thoughts about that one later on. There's also a new minor stat called Avoidance, and this previously has only been in a few class pets. And by the way, just as an example, if you're a hunter, then you'll find your pet actually takes reduced area of effect damage. Well, that's what Avoidance is going to do to you. Now, it's going to come in much smaller quantities, and their goal is to soften the blow of AoE attacks a little bit, but not allow you to just stand in the fire. There's also a new stat called Indestructible, which basically makes a single bit of gear immune to durability damage. They're also adding Leech. This is one that basically converts a percentage of your damage done or healing done into just, health and like a heal on yourself. So that's kind of useful for everyone. And then we have Cleave. This is proposed, but it doesn't look like it's going to make it in based on what they've said. So they announced Cleave as a minor stat in BlizzCon, but they've ran into some problems. Basically, it was of situational value to DPS classes, it was always good to healers, and it wasn't very useful to tanks. If you think about how a DPS works, Cleave's only going to be useful if you have multiple targets. However, if you're a healer, you're always going to have multiple targets, and if you're a tank, frankly, you don't really care, because threat isn't much of an issue these days. So because of all this, they're just a little bit concerned about it, and they think that any gear that drops with Cleave could end up just being a healer piece. They don't really want that to happen, so they have currently shelved it. However, they're trying to think of how to reintegrate it in a way that makes sense. Okay, so that's all the stats talked about. So I think that overall, on the topic of secondary stats, that's all fine. Really, I think that the reasons they removed Readiness and Amplify are completely valid, and versatility is it's a solid option. So that's fair enough. The controversy, though, comes in with minor stats. I think that, in principle, some of these are definitely fun, but they just have balance implications. So first of all, we have movement speed. Now, movement speed is extremely useful in the game, and now I actually play a little bit of Smite, and I used to play a tiny bit, like 5 hours of League of Legends beforehand, but in PvP in those games, well, obviously it's PvP, but when a character is chasing you, even if they have 2% more run speed, that's the difference between being able to actuate one of your abilities or not being able to actuate one of your abilities. So there really are some severe implications for movement speed. If one character can just move 5 or 6% faster than another in a PvP situation, that's going to be highly problematic. Now, I don't know if any of these minor stats are going to appear in PvP gear, but since PvE gear is still going to be quite usable in PvP, there's definitely a balance concern there. Then another problem with movement speed is that, well, it's strong. If you can run 5% more or 5% faster, it's just, I don't know, I don't think it feels like something that's really a minor stat. That feels important. Now, over Twitter, Blizzard have defended it by saying that it is really an extremely minor movement speed increase. And fair enough, but if it's so minor, then why are people even going to care about getting it? Because chances of you even noticing 1% are pretty low. We'll have to see how this pans out during the alpha though. I'm sure that the minor stats are going to change quite a bit during the testing process, and I'd imagine movement speed will certainly be one to change. Okay, next we have Avoidance. So, playing as from the perspective of a DPS player, Avoidance is pretty cool. You take a little bit less AoE damage. But I don't want this ever to be to the degree where getting a lot of Avoidance means that you are less worried about standing in the fire or anything like that. I get what they're going for, but once again, this just seems like a stat that's too tied into raiding for me. It really feels like it's not superfluous. It feels like the sort of thing that you're definitely going to want on your gear, and just with loot implications and EPGP things. Like, I totally understand from a game design perspective why they're putting these stats in. I just don't know if it's going to fit in that well with the sort of pre-established raid structure that the game has. And then we have Indestructible. Honestly, I don't want this in any of my gear. I don't care about the repair fee, and there is no equivalency between taking no durability damage and actually having an in-game combat boost. Avoidance is good, Leech is good, movement speed is good in combat. It makes, it has an effect. Indestructible, though, may as well not exist. Who the hell's going to want Indestructible on their gear? No one. I mean, okay, maybe it's nice you save a few gold here and there, but still, people care about the combat potential of their gear, that's why they wear it. So Indestructible really is just not doing anything for me. And then we have Leech. I actually find that lifesteal a very fun mechanic, because it can kind of allow for these situations where you're close to death, but you know that by doing a lot of damage, you may be able to sort of pull yourself out of the void. I think because of that, it's really fun, and because of the way that it sort of applies to every class in a equal manner, it's pretty cool as well. I suppose there is definitely some raid value to this, but I don't think it's going to be ginormous. I feel more positive about Leech than I do Avoidance or movement speed, though overall I suppose a lot of these minor stats are just going to be indeed so minor that they don't particularly matter a great deal. In fact, I'd imagine that you would prefer getting a Warforged piece of gear or one with a socket over getting one of these minor stats. And then as for Cleave, I think it's probably the right decision that they've removed it, because you want there to be a degree of similarity in terms of the effectiveness that these stats have for all the different classes, because it's not like, say, I'm a hunter, I don't use intellect. No, these minor stats are going to apply to everyone. So if you were perhaps a DPS or a tank, getting Cleave on your gear would actually feel like a little bit of a bummer. So I'm glad that's kind of been toned down. Overall, it's definitely interesting what they're doing with stats. I disagree with parts of what they're doing with minor stats, though I'm not worried at all, because I think a lot of stuff is going to be found during the testing process, and because of that, I'm 99% sure that things are going to turn out fine. Anyway, do let me know what you think about all these various stat changes, or proposed stat changes, in the comments section. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.